stood at the median with his hood up, tapping his fingers against a cracked plastic cup. Cars rolled to a halt beside him, engines humming. Drivers staring ahead like he didn't exist. But when the light hit red, he lifted his head and sang, not softly, not timidly, but with a voice that carried through car windows and over idling engines. Raw, powerful, and full of something people forgot could exist in a place like this. Every now and then someone dropped $1. Most didn't. But he kept singing anyway, and this particular afternoon, on a narrow stretch of road on the east side of the city, something happened that broke the usual rhythm of indifference. A man in the second lane rolled his window down. Not for spare change, not for conversation, but because he heard something so striking, he thought it had to be coming from a radio. It wasn't. It was coming from the homeless man standing 10 feet away, ripping that cracked cup like his life depended on it. Cars stopped moving, people leaned out of windows. A delivery biker froze mid-pedal for the first time in years. The man with the cup had a crowd, and in one of those cars, third row, driver's side, sat someone he never would have recognized, a record producer whose entire career had been built on spotting the one voice out of 1,000 that didn't belong on the street. He leaned forward, eyes narrowed, mouth slightly open. That voice? It shouldn't have been here, and that moment, this tiny, unlikely pause on a traffic-choked road, was about to turn into the biggest turning point of two lives that had been drifting in completely different directions. But before we get there, let's rewind a little. Because stories like this don't start at red lights. They start way before, the kind of before most people never get to hear. The man's name was Darren Cole, and years back, he hadn't been anywhere near the streets. In fact, he once stood on actual stages. Small ones, sure, but real stages, in real bars, with real people cheering. He didn't have fame, but he had what mattered: momentum, hope, a guitar that stayed tuned, a life that made sense. But life has a way of turning slowly at first, then all at once, a bad break here, a wrong turn there, opportunities drying up, bills stacking, a few choices he wished he could take back, and then just like that, the ground wasn't beneath him anymore. He didn't talk about it, he didn't explain it, but if you listened closely to the way he sang at those intersections, you could hear pieces of the story hiding between the notes, pain he never spoke out loud. And today, that voice carried farther than he ever imagined, across the lanes, across the sidewalks, across the noise of the city, straight into the ears of Evan Hart. The man staring at him from inside that glossy black SUV. Evan wasn't just any producer. He was the kind who didn't need to look for talent anymore. Talent usually came looking for him. His name was on the plaques, the awards, the songs people played at celebrations and breakups and everything in between. Million-fold streams, packed arenas. A career built on moments where he recognized magic before anyone else could hear it. But lately, Evan had been stuck, not with money, not with success. With inspiration, everything felt predictable. Every new artist sounded like a copy of the last. Every project felt manufactured before it even started, and then, out of nowhere, he heard Darren's voice, unpolished, heart-worn, not shaped by industry hands, just real, so real it punched straight through the windshield and into his chest. Evan stared at him through the glass, studying everything, the tired shoulders, the worn jacket, the voice that didn't match the life it lived in. The light was still red, but it felt like the whole world had stopped to listen. Then the traffic signal blinked green, and something happened that no one expected. The cars didn't move, people stayed frozen, waiting for him to finish the line he was singing. It was the kind of moment that shouldn't make sense in a city that never waits for anything, but today, they waited. Then Darren's voice broke slightly, just a tiny falter, like his throat gave out for half a second, and this was the moment that rewired something inside Evan. He didn't hear weakness, he heard truth, the kind you couldn't fake. He opened his door, stepped out, and started walking toward him. A few drivers honked, some looked confused, but Darren barely noticed. He just kept singing, eyes half closed. holding on to the last note a moment longer than necessary because it made him feel like he still had something left in him worth holding onto. When he opened his eyes, Evan was standing right in front of him. Not close enough to scare him, just close enough to listen. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the engine noise and Darren's breath still catching from the last line. "Man, that voice," Evan said softly. Darren froze. Compliments weren't new. People said things when they were moved. But this wasn't the usual kind. This voice came with intention. With weight. "You ever record before?" Evan asked. Darren's eyebrows pulled together. A lot of memories flashed behind those eyes. Good ones, bad ones. Ones he'd buried under years of trying not to feel anything. "Long time ago," he finally said. "Doesn't sound like it," Evan replied. "Sounds like right now." Darren didn't know what that meant. Not yet, but this was the exact moment, the exact second, when the universe quietly shifted beneath their feet, one man searching for a spark. One man holding on to the last piece of himself he thought anyone cared about. And neither of them realized how much this meeting was about to cost, or how much it was going to give back. If you were stuck at that red light and heard a voice powerful enough to stop traffic, would you stay and listen, or would you drive off? Why? Hey there, my wonderful family and friends, welcome back. If you're ready to dive into today's story, make sure to hit that subscribe button and tell me in the comments where you're tuning in from. I love seeing where everyone's watching. And guess what? There's another amazing story coming your way tomorrow, one you definitely don't want to miss. Alright then, let's get started. The air felt different the moment Evan stepped back toward his SUV, not lighter, not heavier, just shifted, like the city had inhaled and was waiting to see what would happen next. Darren stood there with that cracked cup dangling loosely from his fingers. Replaying the conversation in his head, a stranger hearing him sing was normal. A stranger stopping to talk wasn't. But someone asking about recording, that pulled at something he'd buried deep. He had once sat in real studios, nothing fancy, but places that smelled like cables and old coffee and the possibility of becoming someone. He remembered standing behind frosted glass, headphones pressing against his temples, letting his voice fill a room built for sound. Part of him missed that. Part of him was scared of it. Evan didn't get more than 10 steps before he stopped and turned back. "Hey," he called out, "you got a minute?" Darren shrugged. "Yeah, I guess I do. Come with me for a bit," Evan said. "I want to hear more." Darren almost laughed, not because it was funny, but because it sounded like something you'd say to a guy with somewhere to be. But he nodded anyway. Inside the SUV, Darren sat stiffly, like he was afraid he'd break something just by breathing. The seats were soft, the air smelled like leather, and the door shut with a thud that reminded him of a world he'd fallen out of a long time ago. Evan noticed his discomfort. He didn't comment on it. Instead, he tapped his phone, switched on the recorder, and said, "Whenever you're ready." Darren cleared his throat, stared at the dashboard, then he started singing again. This time, there were no cars, no city noise, no wind, just his voice, pure, unfiltered, echoing inside a quiet cabin that felt too clean for a man carrying all his years on his shoulders. Halfway through the second verse, Evan exhaled, slowly, not in disbelief, in recognition. He'd spent decades listening for something real. And this was the kind of voice labels didn't create. This was lived experience turned into sound. He pressed stop, looked at Darren. "You know what you have, right?" Evan asked. Darren shook his head. "I used to." "Well, you still do." For the first time in years, Darren felt something flicker inside him, hope trying to stand up again after a long sleep. Evan pulled out a business card and slid it across the console. Simple black text, no logo, no gimmicks. "Come to my studio tomorrow," he said. "We'll see where this goes." Darren stared at the card like it might disappear if he blinked too hard. "You sure?" he asked. "If I wasn't," Evan said, "I wouldn't waste your time." He didn't mention that he hadn't invited a new artist into his studio in over 3 years. He didn't mention that something about Darren's voice tugged at him in a way he couldn't explain. "Not yet," Darren stepped out of the SUV clutching the card like it was the most valuable thing he'd held in years, and then, the first twist hit. Evan drove only a few blocks before pulling his SUV into a narrow alley behind a row of shops. He parked, cut the engine, rested his hands on the wheel. His chest felt tight, not from emotion, from pain. For the past 6 months, he had been hiding something that explained his creative slump, his sudden withdrawals, his silence. His hearing was fading. Doctors didn't know why yet. It wasn't gone, but it was slipping slowly, then unpredictably, in and out like a light flickering on a failing circuit. Some days he heard perfectly, other days the world sounded like it was underwater, and today, right there in the car, as soon as Darren stepped out, Evan's hearing dipped, the world muffled, the edges blurred, his pulse grew loud enough to fill the silence. He leaned back and shut his eyes, jaw locked, breathing shallow. He didn't want anyone to know. He didn't want pity. He didn't want to be seen as someone who was losing the one thing he'd built his entire life around. And yet, through the distortion, through the fading edges of sound, Darren's voice still echoed vividly in his mind. Clear, real, untouched by whatever was happening to his ears. It was the first time in months that a voice stayed with him after the moment passed, and that terrified him almost as much as it encouraged him. Meanwhile, Darren walked 3 blocks to the shelter with the card still pressed between his fingers. He kept staring at the clean, sharp lettering like it was some kind of joke, but the tremble in his chest said it wasn't. Inside the shelter, he sat on the edge of the cot where he slept most nights, replaying everything again and again. After a few minutes, he pulled out an old flip phone with a cracked screen, the only thing he'd managed to hang on to from the life he used to have. He typed in the number on the card, saved it, stared at it, and for the first time in a long time, he felt scared. What if tomorrow went terribly? What if the studio made him feel small? What if he wasn't as good as the memory of who he used to be? What if he messed up the one chance life had thrown at him in years? But another thought crept in. What if he didn't try? What then? He lay down on the cot, closed his eyes, and let the noise of the shelter fade behind the echo of one line Evan had said to him. Sounds like right now. He didn't know why that line mattered so much. Maybe because nobody had talked about his right now in years. People usually talked about his past, or the mistakes, or the situation, but not who he was in this exact moment. And maybe that was enough to get him through one more night. Evan didn't sleep that night. He sat in his home studio, staring at old gold records on the wall, listening to the same 10 seconds of Darren's voice over and over. Even when his hearing wavered, even when the distortion crept in, the recording still felt alive. At 3:14 a.m., he whispered to himself, "This kid, there's something here." Then something occurred to him, and it made his stomach twist. If he signed Darren, if the world heard this voice, if success followed, as he knew it would, there was a good chance Darren would find out Evan was fighting to hear him clearly. And if that happened, everything could fall apart. If someone offered you a shot at your old dream, but they were hiding a struggle of their own, would you still take the chance? Why or why not? Morning arrived with a pale, washed-out sky, the kind that made the city feel quiet in a way it rarely did. Darren stood across the street from the studio, hands buried deep in his jacket pockets, staring at the glass door like it was a portal into a world he no longer belonged to. The building wasn't huge, wasn't flashy, just clean, modern, understated, like it didn't need to brag about what happened inside. He took one long breath, then he crossed the street. Inside, the lobby felt impossibly calm, soft lights, wood paneling, a faint smell of coffee and soundproof foam. A young receptionist glanced up from her tablet, blinking in surprise at the sight of him. "You're Darren, right?" she said. "Evan told me to bring you straight in already." He hadn't expected that. She led him down a hallway lined with framed album covers, names he recognized, songs he'd heard blasting from car speakers years ago. His steps slowed with each title he passed. He remembered listening to some of these on nights when he still had dreams that felt reachable. The hallway opened into a studio with thick glass walls, a mixing desk that looked like a spaceship console, And Evan standing at the center of it all. He turned as they entered, nodding once. Like he'd been waiting. No handshake this time, no speech. Just a quiet acknowledgement. "Let's see what you can do," Evan said. Darren stepped into the booth, closed the door behind him. And for the first time in years, he felt the familiar hum of silence that only a recording booth could create. The kind that made the whole world shrink down to one microphone and one voice. His heartbeat thumped loud enough to feel in his throat. Evan pressed the talkback button. "Whenever you're ready." Darren took a breath, then another, then he started to sing. His voice didn't explode out of him, it eased in, like he was testing the temperature of the air. Soft, cautious, then growing stronger with each line. Notes wrapped in memory, emotion layered over emotion. Evan closed his eyes, not to focus, but because his hearing dipped again. Static, low distortion, that underwater feeling. He swallowed hard, staying still, pretending nothing was wrong. But he could hear enough, just enough, and even through the fading edges. He could tell, the voice was extraordinary. Not polished, not perfectly controlled, but real. And that was worth more than perfection. When Darren finished, the booth fell quiet. He looked up, tense, waiting for a reaction. Evan hit the intercom. "Again," he said softly. Darren nodded and sang again, halfway through the second take. The second twist hit, the studio door opened. A woman stepped inside, late 40s, sharp expression, carrying a tablet stacked with notes. "Evan," she said, "we need to talk now." Darren stopped midline. The woman, Marissa, wasn't just anyone. She was Evan's longtime manager, smart, calculated, protective. And sick of surprises, she lowered her voice. "What are you doing?" "Working," Evan said. "With who?" Her eyes flicked to the booth window. "You bring in a guy off the street and think I'm not going to ask questions? He's got something. They all have something, Evan. We don't gamble on strangers, especially now." That last part hit hard. Evan stiffened, Marissa softened slightly. Her voice dipping low. "We have to talk about your hearing," she whispered. "You're running out of time to hide it. You can't start new projects when you don't even know if you'll be able to finish them." Darren watched them through the glass. He couldn't hear the words, but he could read the tension like a billboard. Evan stepped away from Marissa and hit the talkback button. "You okay to take 5, Darren?" "Yeah," he said, trying to sound normal. But he wasn't, not even close. He stepped out of the booth, took a bottle of water from the mini fridge, and pretended he was admiring the mixing console. Anything to pretend he wasn't overhearing fragments of a conversation that felt like it involved him somehow. Marissa pulled Evan aside. "This isn't a good idea," she said. "You're hearing. I know, and the board is already nervous about the missed meetings. If they find out, they won't. You can't keep pretending. I don't have a choice." "You do," she said gently. "You step back, slow down, let someone else take the wheel for a while." Evan shook his head. "No, not this time, not with him." Marissa sighed. "You're betting your career on a man you met at a red light?" "No," Evan said. "I'm betting it on a voice I haven't heard in years." And then, the third twist landed. A voice spoke from behind them. "You should have told me." They turned. Darren stood there, his shoulders tense, eyes guarded. "You can't hear, right?" he asked quietly. Evan froze. Marissa's expression dropped. "How much did you hear?" Evan asked. "Enough," Darren said. "And you should have told me." Not angry, not accusing, just hurt. The kind of hurt that comes from someone who's had too many things hidden from him in life. Evan ran a hand over his face. "I didn't tell you because I didn't want it to change anything. But it does." "How?" "Because," Darren swallowed, and the truth slipped out. "Because I don't want to be someone's last attempt at something." The room went still, not awkward, just honest. Marissa stepped back, letting them talk. Evan took a slow breath. "You're not my last attempt," he said. "You're the first thing that's inspired me in over a year." Darren didn't respond. So Evan continued, "If my hearing goes, or if it doesn't, I want to use whatever I have left on something real. And you're real." Darren looked down at the card still in his pocket, looked at the mic, looked at the booth where his voice once again felt alive. Then something inside him shifted, resolve, acceptance, maybe even trust. You really think I can do this? He asked. Evan nodded. 8 figures, he said quietly. That's what I'm prepared to offer, full partnership, no tricks. You and me, we build something from the ground up. Darren's breath hitched. 8 figures wasn't a deal, it was a life he could never imagine. You don't even know me, Darren whispered. I know your voice, Evan said. And that's enough. Silence spread through the studio. Heavy, meaningful. Then Darren said something he hadn't said to anyone in years. Okay. Evan exhaled, relief flooding through him. Marissa shook her head but smiled, the kind of smile someone gives when they realize they've just watched fate unfold right in front of them. That afternoon, they recorded the first full demo. Darren's voice soared, Evan's hearing held steady. And for the first time in years, both men felt like they were exactly where they were supposed to be. No red lights, no cracked cup, no silence hiding truths. Just a voice powerful enough to stop traffic. And a man willing to listen before the world stopped sounding clear. Their partnership would go on to shock the industry, the demo would go viral within days. And the story of the man who sang at red lights would spread further than either of them expected. But none of that mattered as much as the moment that started it all. A song, a voice, and 2 lives colliding at the exact right time. If life suddenly handed you a second chance, one so big it scared you, would you take it, or hesitate? Why?
Thank you for watching all the way through. If this story moved you, the next one will surprise you in ways you won't expect. Go ahead and click the video on your screen. Your next story awaits.